We're going to be seeing a number of things about the trip that I was blessed to be able to take and that you helped me take by providing the funds to do so. So first of all, thank you. Let's also start at Acts chapter 14 and verse 27. Acts chapter 14 and verse 27. What I want to do is what happened after the first journey. In that place we see that Paul and Barnabas are there. It says, "Now when they had come and gathered the church together, they reported all that God had done with them and that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles." And so that's the scriptural description of what I'm here to do today. There are going to be a lot of descriptions of the trip, and I don't want it just to be a travelogue, but it's important that you know the kinds of things that were happening and what we were doing there as a result. Not just me, but also Cody Kane from the Evendale congregation here in Cincinnati, where he serves as a deacon, and Chad Scott from the Douglas Hills congregation in Louisville, where he serves as an elder, along with our host and translator, Prem Kumar, who is a preacher there in the area of India we were in. So let's go ahead and understand a little bit more about the nation to which I was going. First of all, if you look at the three largest nations by population in the world today, here you go. You've got China at barely over 1.4 billion. You've got India at barely under 1.4 billion. And then in third place with less than a quarter of as much is the United States with 333 million. Now that alone, I think, tells you a lot about the sheer number of people in India that are able to be reached in this way. And going to India is a lot easier than going to China in many ways, and being able to teach there. So there we were in India, and by the way, since China has actively discouraged a lot of population growth for decades, and now that even if they're kind of easing up on that, they're still not growing as fast as India. India should be the largest nation in the world by population within the next 5 years or so. They're 30 million behind, catching up fast on China. But also something you need to understand about India is the amount of poverty that's there. The world average gross domestic product per capita per person is a little over $11,000. This is not a perfect description of a standard of living. This is not exactly how much money the average person makes. It's not that, but it serves as a pretty good way to measure relative wealth. In the world, a little over $11,000. In the United States, about $65,000 per person. So roughly 6 times as much. But in India, you have a little over 2,000, or a little less than 1/5 of the world average. Now you will find some very high-tech places in India. If you've done much with computers, you almost spent some time talking to people on the phone who are based in India, or even the telemarketers maybe too. And some of them may well have been in Hyderabad or Bengaluru, a few hundred miles to the south. But you see the level of poverty. India has some extremely large cities, as you might guess from the population. It's really hard to measure. How big is the biggest city? Well, how do you count it? It's a big problem. But of the top tier of cities, where you have somewhere in the 20 to 28 million range of people in the area, you have the capital Delhi, you have Mumbai, formerly called Bombay. And then you have other cities. The city that I was based in was the 4th largest in India, with about 7 million people, and that probably is a figure that's out of date, because it went from 3 million to 7 million, 3.5 million to almost 7 million in 10 years, several years before before I was there. But still, you have a lot of poverty, and India's economy has grown. This is how the second largest nation in the world by population is only the 7th largest economy, and they've actually improved a lot over the past few years. But that gives you an idea of the kind of relative poverty that is there. I want to show you a little bit more about what part of India I was in. And by the way, There are people still alive today who can remember back 75 years ago to when the British gave India independence, which is when I realized that. That just really stunned me to think about that. And not only were the British controlling India, which they took over not so much through their own military, but through a corporation. So if you think corporations have too much power today, just ask people in India and you might find out even more about it. But Pakistan and Bangladesh, which are each among the 8 largest nations in population themselves, were once altogether part of this area with India. But Pakistan and Bangladesh are mostly Muslim, heavily Muslim, as compared to India itself, which is mostly Hindu. I was working in this province, number 24, Telangana, and this province, Andhra Pradesh, which is number 1. Over here, they take up that area. They were one province until about 7 years ago, and they are in the middle of splitting up into 2 provinces. Hyderabad is the capital of the Telangana province. But just to give you an idea of scale of how large the country is, if you put Ohio right about here, it would be about the same size as the province of Telangana. But Ohio has 11.7 million people. Telangana itself has 35 million. And Andhra Pradesh has 50 million. Compared to that, California has about 40 to 42 million right now. So in the space of, let's say, Ohio and Pennsylvania together, you have 2 Californias worth of people. Truly amazing amount of people who are there. And those are not the biggest provinces in India by any means, not even close. When I was there in the area, we even only worked a small part of that. Where I've highlighted in yellow is generally the portion, and of course we weren't anywhere near everywhere in those areas. But again, to give you a sense of scale here, starting from about here near Hyderabad, as I'll tell you, we took an overnight train for an express train for about 8 to 9 hours each way to get to some of the area we were preaching in. That took us from here to about here. An overnight express train. Gives you an idea of the scale of the country. Also, the predominant language in both of those provinces is called Telugu. I worked on it before getting there enough to be able to have, let's say, an 18-month-old's vocabulary in Telugu. Not much. But there are still, despite the fact that it might seem like some sort of very limited language, it still has 83 million speakers. And it still is the 15th most spoken language in the world, according to statistics that I got, in this case from Wikipedia. And the script of Telugu is pretty distinctive. The first verse that we read, I have put up here in Telugu as well. So we have more, you kind of get a little bit of a sense of the language that is there. It has 36 consonants and 16 vowels. And the vowels are sometimes written into the consonants. So it isn't the easiest thing to learn. If you look at India as a whole, you're looking at a nation that is mostly Hindu, 75 to 80% Hindu, with a substantial Muslim minority. In the country as a whole, Muslims make up about 15% of the population. But India is so huge that it is actually the country with the 3rd largest number of Muslims in it, even though they're only about 1/7 of the population. And those who would consider themselves Christian are only about 3%. And then you have the Sikhs, the Buddhists, the Jains, and some other groups as well. This is the congregation's meeting place where we began and ended our trip near Hyderabad, in a place called Lalapet. And for the time being, the congregation meets up on the 3rd floor of this office building right above a doctor's office. You'll notice there is a whole lot of English on the signs, and that's common in India as well. Sometimes you wonder how well that it worked out. You'll notice the hair cutting place for men, the barbershop, is called barbarous. Means something different in English than barber, as it turns out. But you still have a lot of English. There aren't that many people who speak a lot of English, but there are a lot of people who speak a little. And so sometimes you see that even more than you would see Hindi or Telugu. But there we were up in a couple of rooms that would easily fit in our auditorium in that area. On the first day, Sunday, we worshiped there, and one young man with whom Prem, the preacher, had been studying, he indicated he wanted to be baptized. And Prem has been studying for a while. His family is Christian. So the congregation doesn't have their own baptistry. That might look a little different than you're used to for a baptistry. On the ground floor of a nearby school, they knew some people. They opened up the courtyard and the ground floor of the school, and that water trough is about 5 feet by 3 feet. It was enough for Harish to be baptized that first Sunday that I was there. So that was on that first Sunday when we were worshiping there. Let me describe worship services to you a little bit there. Things are different in culture. Sometimes people will go ahead and just start singing when they get there, even before the service starts. And I've heard about this, but I haven't experienced it myself in some other places. Even if it's 45 minutes before everyone gets there, they're still singing and singing. To begin the service, basically, we started by singing. We sang 5 songs. It took 30 minutes. And they sang and sang and sang. They have songbooks, there are no notes. And there's a song that will sometimes take up only less than 1 page of a small book. And it still lasts more than 5 minutes because I think there's a lot of repetition in singing. And they sing. Not everybody gets there at exactly the same time, but once they're there, they're there. And the worship assembly itself, from the time, this was not unusual at all, from the time people get there at roughly the posted time, until everything is all taken care of, it may be 2 hours, just on the assembly itself. So after having worshipped there at Lalapet, we were able, the next day, we did see a little bit of the city itself. This is the Charminar. It's 430 years old, kind of a symbol of Hyderabad. And this goes back to some of the history of the city. Hyderabad was a center of diamonds and pearl trade. In fact, for a long time, it was one of the only real sources of diamonds in the entire world. And that brought it a great deal of wealth, where they were able to build things like that. But on Monday, we taught at the same church building as the rooms that the church met in. We taught about 15 different preachers who came. We went through a study of the book of Romans. We could only do the first couple of chapters. Cody and Chad and I would take turns teaching. And as we would make a statement, Prem would translate it into Telugu. So, yes, we did a lot of speaking, but Prem did more than any of us as we were gathered together there. So we spent a few hours teaching several lessons. We were down in Hyderabad that afternoon. And we continued on that for the second day. We continued with our classes, taught a total of 6 classes that lasted almost an hour to the preachers who were there. Then on Tuesday night, after worship on Sunday and classes with preachers to help strengthen them, we got on the overnight train and we went out toward the Indian Ocean coast. But then we started driving into what's called the forest. What they mean by the forest is an area, and yes, it generally is forested, that tends to be away from the bigger cities. That doesn't mean nobody lives there. It doesn't mean that you can't get a cell phone signal there, although I couldn't get a cell phone signal there or any internet for most of the trip. But you will be able to find people there. This is kind of, in Lama Singhi, this is where we met some of the preachers who helped guide us back into the main part of the area. Where we parked, in Lama Singhi, what this is kind of a wide spot on the road, where the road kind of breaks up. It's kind of like a freeway exit off the interstate before you go to a popular tourist area, except that the freeway and the exit and the shops are all in one, spanning about 100 feet or so from side to side. watch where you're walking and where the cars are driving at the time. But even there, you'll notice that what happens here is where we had parked in one area is right next to one of the many Hindu temples. You'll find these dotting roadside everywhere. And quite often what you'll find is there will be some sort of deity. This one might be the monkey-faced and tailed deity that they have. That will be off in the furthest part back of the building, the sanctuary. And oftentimes in Hindu temples, you will see a mountain, a distinctive structure on top of it. But they're everywhere, and this is just one example of it. We drove several hours from where the train had stopped at Toomey up into the forest, and we went to Durupalli. And I was preaching for the first time myself. I taught some classes preaching for the first time that Wednesday afternoon in Vidurupalli. And the way they often did it was they would have one person preach, and then another person would give a shorter lesson after that. And if it was a worship assembly on a Sunday, then there would be another person who would give kind of a talk before the Lord's Supper that's longer than most of the ones that we would have there. So that and the translation means it took a little while. I preached on saving faith here in Vidurupalli, and afterwards 11 people wanted to be baptized. And so we started baptizing them. It was maybe about a quarter-mile walk down a very narrow rocky trail down to the creek. You can see where they have the stones built up there. It makes a little bit of a dam that makes the water back up a little bit there. There's enough room to baptize. This is Prem right here, who is there, who will do a good bit of the baptizing himself in many cases. And we have baptism after baptism, after baptism, and after baptism, and about 7 more that I didn't picture, just on that Wednesday afternoon. As I was truly amazed to be able to be a part of that, I don't pretend that my lesson was the only thing. It wasn't the only thing said, and it wasn't the only work that anyone would have ever done with these people. You have quite a lot of the village that does turn out to be there. Going back just a little bit, there is a church building, but they also set up a covered area where the actual preaching, in this case with the tarp underneath and the tarp or other cloth above, took place. And in this very tiny village, we still probably had, I don't remember exactly, at least 80, maybe over 100 people who would come on a Wednesday afternoon in order to listen to the gospel. The gospel still has its effect on people who will listen to it and respond to it. So we had 11 baptisms, and then later that night, we also went over to another meeting, I believe, that Wednesday evening. We also went over to stay in Kalapari in another village. That's where we put our stuff for staying the night, and then we went for a late meeting over to yet another village, and went over to, had a late night, fairly late night, gospel meeting type of situation there as well. Now, this building was an unheated, mostly concrete building. They built a lot in concrete. Wood and heat and humidity would not hold up very well in the long term. And preached there. Now, this is something that just shows kind of what you're used to. That night, and we were up in the mountains, it was colder than in Hyderabad itself, but it was dipping down into the 50s or something that night, maybe well down into the 50s, toward 50 itself. And I wore a short sleeve shirt that day, and I was thinking, I wish I'd worn long sleeves. But I was okay. The Indians who came, many of them were in heavy coats, and some men were in toboggan hats until the first prayer when they took them off. Because to them, it was bone chilling. But to us, it was just mildly cool, and in January, it was great. In Hyderabad itself, the lowest temperature that's been recorded since 1950 is 43 degrees Fahrenheit. In the summer, it can get up to 43 degrees Celsius or so, which would be about 109 degrees, and get there pretty regularly. That also, I think, explains why men don't wear ties, much if at all, in India, because if at the coolest time of year, the high is about 80, and there is air conditioning only very, very rarely, maybe in a restaurant, for instance. That's not something that's going to make a lot of sense. But what they did, they wore usually long-sleeve button-up shirts, and they wore slacks, and that is how they honored God. And in an area where there's not a lot of wealth to be had, I have every reason to think that they fully honored God within their culture with what they did. On Thursday, we went over, these are a number of orphans who have been taken in by members of a congregation in this area in Muru. Let's call it Muru, is called that village name. I don't have all of the village names down there. But what we did was we went over and we visited them. These have been taken in by a number of members of the church there. Whether their parents are both dead or whether they've been neglected, my understanding is some of these children, to survive, were working 10 hours a day in the fields. They've been taken in, they've been taken care of by members of the church there. Prem himself, who was over here with another preacher from Kalapari over here, Prem himself has one son biologically and 5, maybe even from some of these orphans in this area that he and his wife are raising as their own. So they have 6 boys between ages roughly 7 and 12 themselves. After that, we taught classes a short distance away in the Muru village. Give you an idea, the lectern that we use to teach from in Muru, it looked like a packing crate wrapped in old newspaper with packing tape all around it to hold it together. They had another lectern, a little bit like that, but much smaller, except that when you leaned, it would lean with you, so I didn't try to put too much weight on it. And also in Muru, a lot of what people do in many indoor situations there, in services in particular, is they take their shoes off before coming in. Probably the first time since I was a toddler that I've ever been through any worship assembly without shoes on. And in Lalapet, where you're in a very urban environment, it doesn't make that much difference. It was starting to grow on me a little bit, but I do not intend to introduce that here. But when we got to Muru and started going in, I said, I'm going to do what people here do. I'm going to take off the shoes, and then I'm going to go in. What I did not know at Muru, the floor was a tarpaulin-colored, covered rock surface. Pointy rocks, no less. I kept my shoes on some of my subsequent visits there after I was done hurting my feet that way at first. But we had 2 days of classes, getting through 6 lessons, with about 30 preachers who came over to the Muru village as well. So in another evening, we went over to this village, which is way out. You might think, well, weren't you way out before? Well, this is way, way out. So much so that we had hired a car. It was an undersized, underpowered SUV. And twice we had to get out, and once we had to push to help the car get up the hill. Well, we got there, and again, you get to a place like this, even though you have a shelter with a cloth over it. You have the chairs set out. Sometimes you have some people inside, some people outside, but still it wasn't unusual to have 60, 70 people, a large share of people who lived there, in there. And this may have been the building in which the sides of the permanent part of the building were kind of open, ventilation, under the eaves of the roof, and only about 6.5 feet tall at the center, less at the eaves. Chad, who is from Louisville here, he is a very tall fellow. He's about 6'3" or so. And when he got up to preach, he went all the way to the ceiling, almost a little higher. And another thing that is different that just kind of illustrates this is that it might have been in this building, or the one I'll talk about next, in which I looked, and the beams holding up the roof were bamboo, wrapped in newspaper. So again, we're not talking about fancy at all. But still, there are Christians who are worshiping God, who are there. And that's something I think to think about whenever we start maybe feeling uncomfortable or something like that. We need to realize what our brothers and sisters do. There were other baptisms that were there. Over here at this village in particularly, this is after we had been in this area for a couple of days, shortly before we were going to get back onto the overnight train and come back to Hyderabad toward the end of our first week. We had about 5 more baptisms there, so with 11 in Viduropalli, with about 6 that came from the meeting I think I was showing you before, and then another 5 baptisms that were there. So there were 20 baptisms there just from our trip. We had 1 at Lalapet before we started traveling, where there were 2 when Chad and Cody were there before I were there. So we're up over 20 that were there. There were some baptisms that waited until the next day because it might be 10 p.m. before the service was over, and it was dark, it was cold for them, and much more than here, you're not quite sure what would be in the water with you when you were there. So those were often handled on the next day. So we had a number of baptisms here before driving back to Tuni, taking the overnight train back to Hyderabad, and spending only a few hours in Hyderabad before traveling again, and eventually getting over to Umadi Devarapalli, and we preached there on Saturday night. It was very interesting. I was preaching for the second time there, and we were kind of welcomed into the village by everybody. Some people threw flower petals to welcome us. They had a portable microphone system, and no matter how small the building was that they were meeting in, it had electricity and it had a microphone system. And oftentimes the microphone was very, very loud. Sometimes it was announced to all of the passersby in the area that were there. But we preached on Saturday night and had about 200 people here at this tiny village coming in, taking up the L-shaped courtyard around the church building in Umadi Devarapalli, people sitting near the edge of it, probably about 200 people. And there were several people who, from that night, wanted to be baptized. We worshiped at the same place Sunday morning, again, about 2 hours, all assembly, no Bible class. And then we had 5 baptisms that were there. This is a small lake because it's the dry season. If it were the rainy season, it would be covering many times more. It's actually on the border between the 2 states we were working in. And after we'd gone in, baptized 5 people in this lake, I think as soon as we were done, that's about when the herdsman and his water buffalo came through, and they exited the lake not too long after we had the baptisms there, which again was a little bit different. We're not used to wandering water buffalo and zebu. They wander on the road. They may not be supposed to have the right of way. When you weigh 1,500 pounds, you do, like that. And so a lot of things that were just very different as well. You do see some of the water buffalo resting on the opposite shore in the background there. So that is in Umadi Devarapalli. That's also where we would teach a number of classes, a couple of days worth of classes of the preachers there too. There we had something different happen. We had about 15 preachers come, but we also had some people who were from the village who just wanted to learn, including young people who would come and sit through hours of translated lectures on Romans because they wanted to hear more of the Word of God, which is beautiful. Let's spend a good bit of time there. This is another place where we were preaching as well. You see it's lit up underneath the canopy that is there. And so we would speak in the evening several times as well, going throughout that week. For this part, before we got back to Hyderabad, we would stay in a hotel in a medium-sized town nearby for 4 nights, and we would continue preaching and teaching as much as we could. I'm back to Hyderabad, and I want to give you, this is the building, the Charminar we saw before, and this is one of the bazaars that you would see there with all the different stores in very old buildings. This one focuses on jewelry, almost exclusively that's there. You'll notice, again, a whole lot of English. This also is in a very Muslim part of Hyderabad, while the area in general might only be about 15% Muslim, and Hyderabad itself, especially here, you're more like 30% Muslim, and here, most of the people, except for tourists, that you would see would be Muslim. Charminar was built by the Muslims. It has to do with the time when you had two different groups of Muslims fighting it out for who would be in charge of one of the wealthier areas on earth at the time. Gives you a little bit of the idea too of how crowded it can be. And also traffic. If you've driven in Chicago and Atlanta and DC and New York, you still haven't come anywhere close to traffic in a large city in India. Every man for himself, 1/10 of the traffic signals or fewer that you would think would be necessary in the middle of a giant city. Sometimes you're not even quite sure why they're there, because sometimes people don't pay much attention to them. Right away tends to be whoever can squeeze into a space without hitting anyone else. At one point I was bumped into by an auto rickshaw, which is halfway between a motorbike and a car. I was only bumped into it 1 or 2 miles per hour, though I should have been more careful, so should he. Such things are not terribly unusual, and every trip we had that ended safely, I was pretty thankful, and kept crossing another one off the list until I could get back. This is some of the things that the Prem and Mary's children did for us while we were there welcoming us. As we got toward the end of the week, we were over for our 4th set of classes. We had a meeting at Exegal. 2 people were eventually baptized there. We spent 2 days teaching in Arlapadu. And in Arlapadu, a lot of the preachers couldn't make it. Some of them, for instance, had things because they lived on a farm. They had to do, like milking buffalo, that would keep them from getting to the meeting place very early in the morning. But there were still dozens upon dozens of women with their kids, other people from the village who just wanted to hear the gospel. So we preached an extra 2 Bible lessons for them on the Thursday or Friday morning. And then, as everybody else got there after lunch, then we had a couple of classes too, continuing on through the Romans. And there were people who would be there for hours, who would be there starting before 10, going till after 3. No problem, sitting on the floor, listening to God's Word. We eventually had a total of 8 baptisms. I baptized 4, but I didn't take any selfies while I was doing it for obvious reasons. Chad would also baptize 4. Here we have Prem, and we have Chad. We have the fellow who preaches in Arlapadu itself, and we have the person who is going to be baptized over there. And there were 8 more baptisms that were there. This was in a lake near a rice field. It was a lake that went down, which went down pretty quickly from there, so I took off my socks and shoes, and I hopped down to the shore, and I waded out very carefully with the pointy rocks on the bottom, and was able to baptize people. Those were the only 4 I baptized personally over the course of the trip. Other things we saw, having finished up on Friday, we were mostly done there. This is a rhesus macaque. Almost certainly we saw a number of them, 25 to 30 of them on the trip, sometimes in people's yards, sometimes alongside of the road, sometimes in a heavily forested area. It was pretty neat, of course, to see those. This is something that illustrates India in another way. They are building a superhighway along the path that we took. In some places, the superhighway is finished. You can see some of the retaining wall being built there, the different supplies for the walls they're going to build, this flattened area, maybe in the dry season that they're planning to build. And in the middle of this big construction project where they're building the superhighway, well, right now it's just in the middle. Some people are walking in and out all over the place. Flock of goats, goats hanging out in the middle of the big superhighway construction project. Yes, things change. There are some things, of course, that don't change nearly so much. We went back to Lalapet, preached again at Lalapet on the final Sunday 1 week ago. And they only have 1 service in the morning. It's a long service, only 1 service. We went to the Golconda Fort. Parts of this might date back to the 1300s. Most of this would date back to the 14 or 1500s. and some of this has been restored, but a lot of it probably remains. The rulers of this area were in there, so we did get to spend a little bit of time. This wasn't vacation. This was something that we went there, and at the beginning we did have an afternoon where we could see some things, and the final day before the last, actually it was a Sunday after services, we did that. One other place we stopped by briefly. But we spent a lot of time traveling, a lot of time teaching, a lot of time preaching, the three of us, with Brenna as well. Beautiful place, very interesting place. All sorts of things from a part of the world we're not very familiar with. What's most important was that you had over 35 people obey the gospel, and many, many more who were also coming and listening, apparently who were members of the congregation. But that's what was happening in the village. And they came and they listened. And it's different too, because even with those who call themselves Christians, being only 3% of the population, I preached in Umati Deborah on Jesus Christ as God the Son, the deity of Christ. And I thought, I wonder what any Muslim neighbors would think about this. I said, well, I think I know what they would think about this, but what anyone might decide to do, I don't know. But nothing happened, and probably was not going to happen. But it's a little bit different. When you're preaching about something like this, you can preach about idolatry. And for us, that tends to be kind of an abstract thing. It's not in India, where you will, even in a poor, thinly populated area, there you have between two sets of locked metal gates sometimes, you have a Hindu temple of some sort, or some sort of holy site with the statue of one of the various deities. Maybe it's the one with the blue skin, or with the green skin, or with the fangs pointed outward, or with the monkey-ish face, or whatever thing that seemed very odd to us. It very, very much is real to them. And so those kinds of idols are dangerous, but so are the non-material kinds of idols that we see in our own life as well. I'll give you a little bit more of an idea. This is a picture I took as we were trying to drive through the area where Prem and Mary and the 6 boys lived. And this is, you have these big apartments, things built what would seem to us a little haphazardly. And this is actually the wide part. When you get over here into this area, you get to the narrow part where people park their produce carts, people park their motorbikes along, and to get out of their neighborhood, you'll often have to creep along these very narrow alleys between 3 to 4 story buildings and move other people's motorcycles out of the way, get them a little bit more toward the wall so you can pass through every time you're going in and out of their neighborhood. And that's not a terrible part of the town. They have an apartment that is certainly not luxurious by Western standards or by any means, but it seems like a reasonably safe part of the city. Doesn't seem particularly poor. There's some smaller ones on the first floor. There's second, and up on the third were 2 smaller areas. We stayed in one of them. And yet, it's a very different world. And it kind of makes it hard to get out, exercise, and do some things that we'd like to do in that area. I just want to close on one note very briefly. Let's go over to Genesis chapter 18, verses 2 through 8. One of the things that I noticed, and I might add, is that there were lots of people who wanted very much to serve us while we were there. So people who wanted to take care of us, have more. And sometimes when they wanted us to have more, you didn't want to be impolite, but you weren't sure how much they had to start with. You weren't sure how much you wanted to take, how much you feel comfortable taking. I don't know who was who, but there were apparently some people in those areas who really only had one meal a day. Some of our brothers and sisters who were doing that. But there were people who, despite, and maybe obviously some people that were better off, they wanted to serve. And that's something that I take away. In Genesis 18, starting in verse 2, we read about Abraham. So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground, and said, My Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant. Please let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh your hearts. After that you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant. They said, do as you have said. So Abraham hurried into the tent of Sarah and said, quickly make ready 3 measures of fine meal, and knead it to make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to the young man, and he hastened to prepare it. So he took butter and milk and the calf which he had prepared, and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate. Abraham was, from what we read, quite well off. However, when other visitors came to him, he, despite being a man of possessions, himself was standing there while they ate. And while he said, have a morsel of bread, he prepares a feast for them. I felt like there were people who were doing that for me while I was there, because they were appreciative of people coming and preaching the Word of God to them. And part of me says, well, just sit down, just sit with me, don't just stand there and sit with me. And how much do you have? I don't want to eat too much. And yet you realize that what they were doing out of great love for you and for God's Word. And it's something that I think really stuck with me. I do hope to speak more next week, including on some of the challenges on such a trip. And but I wanted to give you an overall picture of the trip that you have paid for, that you have helped, that you have prayed for, that you have sent me to be able to do. Before that, though, I want to go over with you to Romans chapter 10 and verses 9 through 10. We weren't able to get this far in Romans in our classes there. But it illustrates something that I preached about at 3 different places. I preached a total of 5 sermons there. I taught, I gave other short talks, and taught 6 to 8 other classes while I was there. But when I preached on saving faith, and that was what Prem had wanted, this was something that I emphasized. In Romans chapter 10, verse 9, it says that if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus, and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. With the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. The point that I made there, as I make here, is that saving faith is not a matter of just what I think or what I feel or my personal belief about something. It's something that acts. It's something that obeys. It's something that is willing to confess. It is something that leads us to be baptized. And many people were. In chapter 10, verse 13 of Romans, it says, for whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. If you go back to Acts chapter 22 and verse 16, we see more what is meant there. As Paul is recounting what Ananias said to him, and now, why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. Well, 3,000 weren't baptized on this trip, but about 3 dozen were. And it's an amazing thing I was able to be part of. I also am trying to set up a video that you can see afterward if you want to, in which you'll be able to see Prem translating for me as I taught a class there. I hope to be able to show that to you soon. But remember, the gospel message is the same for you and me as it is for the people in India. Yes, culture is different, the physical environment is different, but if you, like the people in India, realize that you have sinned and you want to be forgiven of that, you want to have the blood of Christ wash away your sins and to begin a life of faithfulness as a Christian, we'd be delighted in helping you with that.